Hello and welcome back. This mini lesson is going to cover how the muscle cells use ATP. We're going to focus still on our skeletal muscle for the most part, and then we'll wrap up. The last slide is going to talk about different fiber types, so fast twitch, slow twitch, red or white, whatever you want to call them. So let's jump in. When we take a look at how ATP is provided to your muscles, we need to kind of see the source and how much each of those sources can give, how much energy each of those sources can give to the muscle. So we're going to first take a look at the units that we're going to compare. So the units we're going to compare are either numbers of twitches. Okay, so how many twitches, right? So remember, twitch was a latent period, a contraction, a full relaxation. But remember, twitches aren't that great of a contraction to do any work. So what's a more realistic contraction? It's even not super realistic, but let's say the duration of an isometric tetanic contraction. So remember, tetanic is the muscles are completely contracted, there's no relaxation. So how many twitches can this energy source provide, or how long can we do an isometric tetanic contraction? So if we're just going to look at straight ATP, what this means is if you're just take a snapshot at any moment in time of your skeletal muscle cell, you have enough ATP just floating around in your sarcoplasm, the cytoplasm of your cell, to go through the hydrolysis. Remember, hydrolysis is breaking ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate, to do about 10 twitches or about 2 seconds worth of tetanic contractions. So really, that's not a lot. If this quantity means anything to you, 3 millimoles, it's, most people don't know what a millimole is. You don't need to know that. But all of this to say, you don't have very much available, just like straight on ATP floating around in your muscle cells, which is kind of weird because we need ATP to do a lot of stuff. So where does this additional ATP come from? Well, the next energy source is something called creatine phosphate. So we have about 20 millimoles of creatine phosphate, and what it does, you have lots of ADP. You have way more ADP floating around in your cells than you do ATP. So when you need ATP, the creatine phosphate will donate its phosphate group to ATP, and then the ATP will then get to release that energy at the myosin head. So the amount of creatine phosphate that you have it can phosphorylate enough ATPs for 70 twitches or about 15 seconds worth of tetanic contractions. So again, not a lot. So between direct raw ATP or ATP produced by the breakdown of creatine phosphate, we have less than 20 seconds worth of tetanic contractions, 80 twitches, which isn't going to do very much for us. So where do we get most of our ATP from? Well, the last two rows are discussing glycogen. So remember, glycogen is hundreds and hundreds of molecules of glucose hooked together, stored in your muscles, stored in your liver, it's all over your body. We break down the glycogen to release the individual glucose molecules. All right, so we have the same amount, but with glucose, we can metabolize it in a couple different ways. So if we want to just use glycolysis, right? So remember, glycolysis is you start off with 1 molecule of glucose, you end with 2 pyruvic acids, and you get 2 net ATPs per molecule of glucose. So for all of the glycogen that we have that could be broken down into glucose, and the glucose could be broken down via glycolysis, we can get about 670 twitches or a little bit more than 2 minutes of tetanic contraction. That's pretty good because imagine contracting your muscles as tight as you can for 2 minutes. That's a pretty good amount of energy. But this last row is where we are really going to see most of our ATP come from. So this is when we take the glucose stored as glycogen, we break it down via glycolysis, but instead of being done after glycolysis, we take that pyruvic acid and we run it through Krebs cycle, we gather up all of our NADHs, and we dump it into the electron transport chain, and that ATP synthase is just pouring out a whole bunch of ATP. So look at this, 12,000 twitches, or about 40 minutes of tetanic contraction. That's amazing. So clearly aerobic respiration of your glycogen, which is basically glucose, is going to give you pretty much unending ATP. As long as you have oxygen to do the aerobic respiration, you can pretty much power your muscles as much as you need to. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at inside of the cells and see what's happening at different activity levels. We'll see what the cell is doing at rest, at moderate activity, and at peak activity. So at rest, when you've got plenty of oxygen, you've got fatty acids floating around in your blood, you've got glucose floating around your blood. So what are these resting muscles doing? Well, the glucose that comes in is going to be stored as glycogen. So we don't need to burn that right away. We can store it because we have the fatty acids to burn. Fatty acids go through cellular respiration, very similar to glucose. They skip glycolysis, but they can still go through Krebs and drive the electron transport chain. So we're producing a lot of ATP, okay? But we're not actively needing that ATP. So why we don't store a ton of ATP? Remember, we only have like 2 seconds worth of twitches of ATP. So what we can do is we can actually put that phosphate group, take this phosphate group off, put that onto the creatine to give us our store of creatine phosphate. So when we do need it, we can reverse that equation. And then the oxygen coming in, oops. So then the oxygen comes in to drive the aerobic respiration of fatty acids, and we store our glucose as glycogen, and we have a metabolic byproduct of carbon dioxide. This is a resting muscle, so we're just storing our glucose, we're burning our fats, and we're building up our creatine phosphate. Now let's start doing a little bit of exercise, right? So maybe you're walking around the block, or you're at your elliptical for a little bit, you're walking up some stairs. So here we need more ATP. We need those ATP molecules to drive our pivoting myosin heads from that cross-bridge activity. Well, we can still burn our fats, but in the presence of oxygen. But take a look, we are now releasing some of that glucose. So glycogen gets broken down into glucose. Glucose go through glycolysis to give you pyruvic acid, but then the pyruvic acid gets further metabolized in Krebs and electron transport chain. We get our 2 ATPs from glycolysis and our 34 ATPs from aerobic cellular respiration, plus any more from fatty acids that aren't even accounted for in this picture. And we still are giving carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Okay, we're working. It's good, kind of low level, moderate activity. We're burning our glucose. The key is we still have enough oxygen to use aerobic respiration. Okay. Now, oh man, this is peak activity. You cranked up your stair stepper. You are at the end of your long run, or you're doing your weights. You're really pushing your muscles to the peak level of activity. And look what's missing from the blood. I know the mitochondria has completely been removed from this picture. It's still there. It's just not in use because we don't have enough oxygen to carry out aerobic respiration. So our respiratory rate is so fast, we cannot maintain adequate levels of oxygen to keep aerobic respiration going. So we're still using our glycolysis, making pyruvic acid. We get a couple ATPs here. Now that creatine phosphate that we're making at rest, that's going to allow us this 1-to-1 ratio, producing a couple ATP, or 1 ATP per creatine phosphate, a couple ATPs per glucose, and we're using this limited amount of ATP to support our myofibrils, our pivoting heads. But we can't do that forever because we're going to quickly run out of our resources. Plus, if you take a look at what happens, pyruvic acid gets converted to lactic acid. Lactic acid goes into your bloodstream, and what's going to happen with our pH? pH is going to go down. It's going to become acidic, and then you're going to start feeling fatigued because the pH goes down. Your brain's like, oh, this sucks. You're running out of glucose, you're running out of creatine phosphate, and you're going to run out of ATP. And if you don't have ATP, you're not going to be able to maintain contractions. Okay, so all of your activity levels are using ATP, making ATP, using ATP at different needs depending on the activity. So at rest, you're going to be storing your glucose, you're going to be storing up some phosphates on creatine. Moderate level of activity, as long as you have oxygen, you can burn your fatty acids, you can burn your glucose, you've got plenty of ATP in the aerobic respiration. Once you reach these peak levels of activity, your length of time that you can work is actually going to be reduced because you're running out of your resources and you're building up your lactic acid, which is bringing down your blood pH, which has a negative impact on your cell's functionality as well as your mental fortitude to keep on going. You feel like you want to be done. You're like, I'm done. My pH levels are down. It's saying be done. All right. I have this YouTube. I think this is a video of true muscle fatigue. I don't have a slide of this, but it's listed in the notes here, muscle fatigue. So muscle fatigue is basically true muscle fatigue, not mental fatigue like I'm tired, I'm done. True muscle fatigue is caused by a couple different things. I've already mentioned a few of those. So the reduction in pH because of the lactic acid buildup, the reduction in metabolites, so you're running out of glucose and fatty acids and creatine phosphate. You might also actually be physically damaging the myofibrils. The sarcolemma, if your sarcolemma is damaged, it cannot maintain the action potentials, your calcium levels are thrown off. You're not going to be able to keep those myosin heads bound in those cross bridges. So there's lots of cumulative things that can happen to actually physically make your muscles fatigued, which means your brain might still be in the game, like, hey, I want to contract my muscle, and your muscle's like, nope, sorry, I don't have the things I need to contract my muscle. So this video is of an Ironman competition. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's pretty powerful. These two women are coming over the finish line, and their muscles basically give up on them, but their brains are still wanting to cross the finish line, but they have to do it in an interesting way. Okay. And then recovery. So what happens after you recover? So you have to replenish all of the things that you used up. So after your heavy workout, you need to make sure that you are getting rid of the lactic acid. You need to replenish your oxygen debt, or pay back your oxygen debt. You need to start building up your glycogen stores and your creatine stores and your ATP stores. So at rest, you have to kind of return everything back. So when you do need to become active again, you'll have all of those resources ready to go. Okay, the last slide is just a comparison between our two types of muscle fiber. Again, this is still all skeletal muscle. It has all of the characteristics that we've talked about, but there are some different types of skeletal muscle that you have in your body. So the first type is called fast fibers. So these are large in diameter. They are usually sometimes called white fibers or fast twitch glycolytic fibers. You might hear those words come around before, So they have, so here we can kind of see the difference between the diameter, right? So here's your, can't get the right color, there we go. Here's your white fiber, so it's striated. And then here's a slow fiber right next to it, okay? So your slow fibers are smaller in diameter. They are more vascularized. They have more myoglobin, which stores oxygen. They're more fatigue resistant. So a lot of times your fast twitch are like your quick moving muscles, like they show in your eye, like your eyes go ding, 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 ding. They can do like a fast movement, where your slow fibers are more for your endurance, like your postural muscles, some of your leg muscles, your arm muscles, your back muscles. So those are going to be the slow twitch because we don't want those to fatigue as quickly. And you are born with your distribution of fast and slow fibers. It's a genetically predetermined characteristic of your body distribution. But with proper training or different kind of training, you can actually convert some of those to the other type. So if you are doing more weightlifting, kind of quick action, you can convert some of your slow fibers to fast. And then they're, in that case, they're called intermediate. Or if you are doing more endurance training, you're doing like long bike rides or running, you might turn some of those white fibers, the fast fibers, into the slow fibers. And again, they're still called intermediate fibers. So you can manipulate these distributions based on your physical activity and the training that you can put into it. Okay, all right, so that wraps up this section. The last mini lesson we're gonna have is talking about cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, kind of comparing their characteristics to the skeletal muscle that we've talked about for all of these other videos. Okay, I'll see you next time.